Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here. My name is Raghav. I'm from LongHash Ventures, and I'm honored to have some of the top brains in the ecosystem talking about modularity. So welcome, everyone. Maybe I'll just take a quick minute for letting everyone introduce themselves, and then we can kick it off.
Hello everyone, my name is Amrit Kumar and we are building AltLayer, which started off as a RAS service with the idea that we make it easier for people to deploy rollups. But recently we also started working on this new, concept that we call restake rollup, where the idea is to bring restaking closer to rollups and to offer different services that decentralizes and makes rollups more secure.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrick. I'm leading BD for Gelato. As Gelato, we're similar to AltLayer, one of the rollup as a service provider, but also since then we have evolved in this decentralized cloud service where we basically focus on making it as easy as possible to deploy rollups, as well as different scalability solutions, as well as middleware components, which we will probably go into more detail in a sec, for all developers within the EVM.
Hey everyone, my name is Rahat. So I'm leading the DevRel team over at Movement Labs. So at Movement, we do a couple different things. We're primarily focused right now on launching our coming L2, which is a move-based zkVM that will be on top of ETH. And we're also working towards making sure that other folks can also launch their own move-based rollups as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. So if anyone here is building a rollup, these three are the people that you need to talk to. They'll help you figure out all these stacks in your ecosystem, and they'll help you launch your own rollup. I'll quickly start off the discussion. In the last few years and months, we have definitely seen the modularity thesis really maturing in the ecosystem. But at the same time, there of course has been criticism about the user fragmentation, the liquidity fragmentation that's coming into the ecosystem. On the one hand, we have something like Solana, which is adopting a more monolithic approach, but the modular ecosystem has witnessed some sort of fragmentation in terms of liquidity. Would love to get your views on, how do you think this will evolve in the near future, and how do we solve for these challenges as we go forward?
Sadly, I would say this cycle has suffered in the DeFi aspect in many ways, right? DeFi hasn't really kicked in the way we saw back in the day during DeFi summer. So I would say modularity, in my view, at least in the last year or so, has affected user fragmentation rather than that much about liquidity fragmentation. So you could actually see people launching rollups and now wondering, how am I going to get all these users, because all these users are sitting on Base or somewhere else. So I think liquidity, you'll see it. That will happen for sure, and people are actually working towards addressing that. But the immediate concern that I'm seeing from people building rollups is they want to figure out how to bring those users. Because it's very unclear. If you're a user, you can't be using, you might be holding, 50 tokens, but it's not fair to ask them to go and play or transact on 15 different chains. It's just difficult. And so I would say, from my perspective, liquidity, yes, it's an issue, but user fragmentation is a much bigger issue in my opinion. People want to be able to tap into Ethereum's user base directly. And if you look at, by the way, rollup as service, the kind of clients that we have been supporting, many of them are game-based chains, so they're building chains that would run games on that chain. There are people building social networks on that. So liquidity in terms of financial liquidity is not that so important for them. And by the way, even the first wave of people who were actually building rollups on their own, they were mostly gaming people, so game developers, because they wanted to have a good or offer a good user experience to their end gamers, right? And so they were for DeFi, we're not the first ones to use rollups, because DeFi guys felt, I want composability. I want to be able to use Uniswap directly, and I can't do that if I have rollups. So they were very pushing back on having rollups. I guess DYDX was probably the one that started off the wave that I want to have my own chain, even though I'm a DeFi project. But still, I would say a big majority of people actually building rollups are still mostly non-DeFi projects. And for them, liquidity is not the biggest concern. It's mostly user fragmentation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the problem is really complex, and there's different verticals that have different problems. I would agree that the user fragmentation is the biggest problem for like gaming projects, because of course they don't really care if somebody deposits TVL into like a game smart contract. This isn't really their KPI that they're optimizing for. But for a lot of DeFi projects, it gets increasingly difficult if they launch their own chain and they might already have a footprint on like Arbitrum or Base to then get that liquidity on their chain, because of course they, as a DeFi project, you will likely want to launch as an L2 these days, which means you can, even in the worst case, your users can still withdraw funds to Ethereum. And we have seen that like a lot of projects are still concerned, even with Base and Arbitrum growing a lot of TVL, that they're not as comfortable yet in trusting in their security, because bottom line is they're still relying on one centralized sequencer. And I think the liquidity fragmentation really comes from the lacking trust in like L2s to be like fully decentralized, because truthfully they aren't. They're fully centralized for now, and there's like one big risk of failure with sequencers. Like when Arbitrum, for example, forgot to basically deposit ETH to pay for gas fees on L1, the chain stopped had some downtime. And I think to really to solve the problem of liquidity fragmentation, the trust into those L2s needs to grow, or obviously the shared sequencing between L2s gets actually into production, so that you can build these ecosystems that are available, so that you can seamlessly bridge between chains. And then at the same time, obviously, for the users that you want to onboard, I think the key decision is how can you get those users from Base, from Arbitrum onto your L3. And for that, I think there isn't a clear solution on the market yet. However, I see a lot of like projects like Galaxy or Layer 3 working on solutions that will help a lot with like that user fragmentation problem.
But would you say, you talked about the challenges in terms of security and decentralizing the sequence. So would you say if most of the layer 2s or the big layer 2s are able to decentralize their sequences today or tomorrow, will that significantly solve the problem of liquidity fragmentation, or it's just a step forward in terms of where we want to be?
I think it's very depending of which framework you're talking to. Because, for example, Arbitrum is working very closely with the Espresso team.
Yeah.
And if everyone would opt into that network, yes, the liquidity fragmentation would significantly decrease, and you would have shared liquidity across those chains. However, that doesn't obviously mean that everybody would opt in from day one, right? So it will still take time.
Sorry, if I may add, I mean, just to be pedantic, right? Decentralized sequencing is not going to be enough, right? Because everyone could build their own set of sequencers and still decentralize, but it doesn't help in any way whatsoever. The liquidity problem, it has to be shared. Like, so in my opinion, yes, shared sequencing is important, but then all sorts of issues comes in, right? Because how do you bring liquidity and all that? But yeah, just to be pedantic here, decentralizing sequence is not going to be enough. It has to be shared in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a question that I asked with the Arbitrum co-founder yesterday at an event, that you're talking about, they're definitely thinking in the direction of decentralizing the sequencer. The question was, would you want any other layer 2 to be able to plug into that sequencing solution? Or is there some sort of concerns that the other layer 2s that are coming in, do they bring any inherent security risk? Do you want the system to be permissioned? So maybe on those lines, Rahat, would love to understand, Movement Labs is coming up with M1, M2, and you guys are also thinking in this direction. Would you imagine a future where there are maybe 100 move-based rollups and all of them have a shared sequencing solution? Or what kind of future do you envision, the ecosystem that Movement Labs would like to see for the ecosystem, to solve some of the challenges of liquidity and user fragmentation?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it goes back to what you were just saying. Like, we definitely need a shared sequencer. And that's part of what we're working on the M1 side. So that's going to be a shared sequencer in like the Move ecosystem. At the end of the day, like what we're trying to provide is like, okay, here's, plug and play this VM. If you want to use EVM, you want to use Move, that's fine. If you want to be part of this ecosystem within, using the shared sequencer side of things, that's where it's going to unlock more of like the interoperability between a lot of these chains. Like you could build on OpenStack, build on ZK, whatever, and then plug in through, using our M1 solution or whatever. So that's kind of like the direction that we're going towards. And I think probably like a lot of other folks in the industry are probably thinking along those lines as well. Definitely agree that decentralization is not going to be enough. At the end of the day, like if you look at just the users, whether it be DeFi users, gaming users don't care whether it's centralized or decentralized. So like you have a whole set of users outside of DeFi who will never care what you do with your sequencer, right? And this is really more important, I guess, on the DeFi side of things. So yeah, I mean, we're kind of like continuously optimizing for one specific set of users, but there's definitely other users who simply don't care and just want to be able to build and use different products. So we're also kind of like thinking that through as well.
Got it. So what I'm understanding is there could be slightly different approach in how we tackle the DeFi use case and how we focus on the gaming ecosystem. I'm glad you guys mentioned a lot about the shared sequencing because you as Gelato, AltLayer movement, they're all focusing on enabling developers to build rollup as a service solution or rollups. How are you seeing the market for the demand from rollups team to be a part of the shared sequencer? I'm pretty sure you are already working with teams like Espresso, Astria, and I've seen that you already have partnership with most of the top sequencing solutions. My understanding is that Arbitrum is working with Espresso to build their own solution. Like Optimism could be working on their own, and there could be these pockets of ecosystems emerging. But as an independent team which is just coming to you and saying, "Hey, help me build a rollup," what advice do you give? How do you help them navigate the number of projects that they are in this modular ecosystem? Like, how do you help them, figure out what to do, what not to do?
Yes, this is one of the curse of modularity, I suppose, where if you're a builder, now you have to decide, okay, nowadays people are now building decentralized RPC networks as well, right? Infra is building something like that. So now you have to pick, okay, now I have to pick a decentralized, so is it like decentralized all the way, or you kind of pick and choose somewhere? So, and by the way, it's all of this decentralized has a cost attached to it, right? It's not like, hey, it's all nice and friendly and everything is all good, but you have to pay for it in some way. So for example, imagine if you're a developer and you want to have decentralized RPC network to start with, because that's the first entry point and gateway to your network. One, you have to think about liveness issues. So what happens with this security assumption breaks for that decentralized RPC network? You have to worry about cost for it, right? Sometimes it's not necessarily going to be cheaper. And second part would be, maybe because we have tokens everywhere, so maybe you could incentivize people to actually use it. But there's a cost to it. The second thing is about latency. Because every single time you have a decentralized network, there has to be some mechanism to keep people accountable in some way or some sort of agreement there. And so there's a latency aspect there as well. So now you move from RPC to then sequencing. Well, now that I have an RPC, it goes to sequencer because sequencers are supposed to be protected. Right? You don't want to expose your sequencers to the rest of the world because that would open up all sorts of DOS attacks. So RPC has gone through. Now you have to go and touch sequencer. And again, the element that comes into play is, okay, now I have to be. So again, there are technical considerations and then there are more like business or marketing or ecosystem considerations, right? So you say, okay, now I would go with something like, let's say, Espresso or Radius because they have the least latency for me, right? And then there's, so let's say now you have your transactions ordered. Someone else has to execute them because Espresso doesn't execute your transactions, right? In this ideal open world, once your transactions have been committed on a DA layer, you can actually pick those transactions up and then build your own state. The problem is that that's not permission quite yet, right? Permissionless quite yet. For example, Arbitrum Orbit is building this thing called Bold, where anyone can actually become a validator, but that's not there yet. So now you have to go and pick transactions from the sequencer and then execute them and then commit the final state on the chain. That's, again, a latency component there. If the sequencer was running closest to the executor, you won't have that network latency. So I would say, one, there are these technical elements that people have to judge and decide whether it's actually good for them. And what we have seen is, for example, gaming companies don't like that because every single time you add a certain network on top of that, you have to wait for that latency and that triggers everything. And then, of course, there's this ecosystem and / alignment thing where, if I am, for example, this network or this project is focusing a lot on the gaming side or the DeFi side, I would rather be aligned with them. So I would say, yeah, these are few considerations that people have to make, and we give them pros and cons, and then they eventually decide.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the that modular in that sense is a blessing and a curse, right? People have so many options to choose from, and it's hard to tell like which solution will fit like which customer group and which sort of roll-up group. However, what I believe, I think it will be quite similar to what we've already seen in like different spaces, that depending on the sort of vertical where a given project is in, like gaming, they will probably not opt into like this decentralized shared sequencing network due to latency. But there might be a different network like Espresso or Arbiter with Bold, where somebody that wants to optimize for decentralization, like for example derivatives or perps, that will want to opt into that network and use it because they want to have decentralization first, and maybe that initial the additional second that you have for like actually executing the transaction and introducing that latency is not too big of a problem for them. So I think it will be very depending on the solution, where then people will just opt into it depending on like their offering.
Yeah, slightly changing gears, we talked about the challenges with modular thesis. As I mentioned, it's a blessing as well as a curse. Developers have too many choices to pick from. Lately, we have seen some sort of communication from the movement labs on the lines of integrated thesis. Rushi and some of the folks at Movement have been talking about how our approach is more aligned with the integrated thesis rather than just being modular. Would love to understand how the integrated thesis is different from modular, and how is it different from just a monolithic approach?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like different steps in like the building cycle a little bit. Rushi put out this analogy that was like really good. I think kind of like sums it up a little. It's like if you're looking at building like a luxury car, there like you can, I guess the monolithic approach would be kind of like buying straight from the manufacturer. You get what you get. But developers or engineers or whoever, they want to be able to take different pieces and optimize for certain use cases, right? I want a better engine. I want to replace the EVM with MoVM. I want to experiment and try different things. If I'm kind of like building for one specific use case, that's going to lead me down this rabbit hole into like an integrated chain. I think it's still kind of like an evolution of the modular thesis in a way. Like you still have like the different pieces and parts that you can build with, but at the end of the day, you're building maybe specifically for one use case. And that's how I view kind of like the whole integrated thesis, where like, you're building towards one direction. It's similar to monolithic in the sense that like you might pick a certain set of things of like, parts that you want to build with, but at the end of the day, you still have that choice. Like whether you want to go even like we're giving people the option on like the execution side of things. So like whether you go EVM or MoVM. So yeah, once you just choose what you need for your use case and build that way.
Got it. Thank you. Amrit, you just mentioned that we give developers the pros and cons and then let them decide. But I'm pretty sure that, given your experience in the industry, you of course have some views of your own, some preferences, some biases, maybe even. How independent is your recommendation to a particular team? Or, as Rahat was talking about integrated thesis, where, you could either directly buy something which is like a kind of a pre-made salad, or it's like a bowl where you pick and choose each of your topping. So how do you navigate those discussions where, on what use cases would you say, just pick this solution, or what use cases would you advise, pick these things?
So, okay, in practical terms, the way it works is you have a client that comes in. Sometimes it's sourced by us directly, right? Because, we do our marketing, people come to us and, they know that, we are a RAS builder. In those scenarios, we have a lot more control in some sense, right? Or a lot more power in convincing these people, because we can tell them, hey guys, we work very closely with X person, here are the benefits that you can get. So I would say in that angle, we are somewhat biased. Again, it's very difficult not to be that. The second scenario is where a client comes in, but that client is recommended or comes from a certain underlying stack provider, right? So it could be their OP stack, got this from their BD pipeline, and they said, why don't you go and work with AltLayer, for example? It can be Stack or it could be a DA provider. For example, Avail guys could come and say, hey, here's a client that wants to use Avail with a certain stack. Why don't you help them out, right? So I would say those two are kind of different, right? In one scenario, you can't make, you can't change things, right? So they have a certain mentality, they have certain agreements, and sometimes they may have agreements in place with the underlying stack provider or DA provider. So in those cases, you have to just give them what they want. There's no alternative. In scenarios where you source them, you have some flexibility in some way, right? And sometimes they ask you questions, right? You could say, okay, what do you recommend? Or what are the pros and cons of using, I don't know, OP stack with Avail, or I don't know, OP stack with something else, for example, right? So there are scenarios there where you could give them explanation, but in generally, I would say so in terms of split, I would say it's kind of like 60-40 split at the moment, where like 40% of clients are self-sourced, while 60% of clients come from the underlying stack provider, and we have to follow the guidelines that they've been given from the top.
Patrick, would love to understand, as Amrit mentioned, there's some clients which are sourced by your team, some clients comes from the underlying stack. I'm pretty sure that's true for Gelato as well. Given that a lot of the underlying stack is common for both Gelato, AltLayer, maybe other roll-up as a service solutions, how do you work with the underlying stack provider to ensure that you are the one that is getting, referred? Because, I would imagine Avail, Cilicia, all the DLAs, could potentially work with all the roll-up as a service. So one part is managing the devs who want to build a roll-up, the other is the underlying stack providers. So is there any marketing strategy or some sort of strategy where we try to work very closely with these underlying stack providers to get all the referrals to your team?
Yeah, so like on the ground, how it looks like is you obviously work with the framework providers very closely, but how it actually looks is that most customers that are getting referred are specific to a given vertical. Like for example, AltLayer does restaked rollups. So every restaked rollup will be very interested in talking to them. On our end, we focus a lot on like middleware and partially also gaming, where then somebody comes to us and says they have specific requirements like a perp, that they want to do gasless trading and their own account system and so on. And we are then on the forefront there on that specialization, where then automatically every provider differentiates to a certain extent. Obviously, we work very closely together with the framework providers that they know those differentiations, but then bottom line, at the end of the day, they also want some competition, obviously. So they normally introduce always like 2 or 3 providers, and then it's like up for grabs basically, and you compete so that the customer gets like the best end product.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Rahat, switching, moving ahead with the conversation, I was just going through the Movement Labs website right before our panel as well, and there's a very strong focus on Movement Labs as a network of modular move-based blockchains. When we talk about modularity, I think the overall thesis is that you pick and choose. Would love to understand, why Movement Labs focuses heavily skewed towards Move as a language, and what single advantage would you like to highlight, to everyone that you think is the key that Movement is focusing so heavily on Move?
I think specifically on the Move language, just if you look at EVM in general, Solidity, and just look at like the security risks and like the billion kind of like loss due to these security risks that exist. Like, yes, you can, get better at auditing, get better at XYZ thing in your security. But if you could have a language from the get-go that's been developed for the purposes of being more secure, there are pieces of the Move language that allow for, like kind of like are built to like, one of the most common attack vectors in Solidity is reentrancy. Like the Move language is like one of the things that are built into it is like prevention of these types of attacks, right? Just from the bottom up. At the end of the day, though, like you said, it's still kind of like going by the modular thesis. You don't necessarily have to use the Move language to be able to use our Move VM. So like on our DevNet right now, if you wanted to, you can build with Solidity smart contracts. We have an interpreter that interprets that into Move for the Move VM, and we're trying to make sure that that's also the case when we move on to like testnet and eventually mainnet. So at the end of the day, you still have that choice,
Sure.
But we want to like show people like, okay, you can do that, but for these reasons why, it's going to be more secure. You're going to be able to tap into our tech a lot better if you use the Move language.
Sure. How confident are you in the ability of interpreter to translate Solidity to movement? Sometime back, Nethermind, for example, was working on translating Solidity into Cairo, and that project was shelved this year. From a technical implementation point of view, how difficult is this translation? And would you anticipate most of your clients to write in Solidity? Like on the DevNet, what are you seeing from devs? Are they preferring Solidity? Are they preferring Move? What's the ongoing situation at the moment like?
Yeah, surprisingly, a lot of people are preferring to write in Move. There's a significant amount of, obviously there's a lot of folks coming from like Aptos and SUI ecosystems already know Move great, but there's also quite a few like EVM, kind of like blue chips and folks who are looking into like the Move side of things, right? So I kind of view it as like, okay, if you want to tap into our ecosystem right away, the interpreter exists for that reason. If you want to slowly start transitioning and taking advantage of the Move EM, you can also do that. So you don't have to go all in either way. It's more of like a stepping stone for you to like get into the Move side of things. That said, I know your other question was like around how technically sound the interpreter is. I mean, like I said, right now it's on DevNet. We are seeing a few folks deploy their contracts. Mostly, no issues, but of course, like EVM is kind of like ever evolving. So our research team is definitely like looking into like best ways to keep that kind of like going there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Coming back to one thing, Amrit, you mentioned initially, this entire thing was started by DYDX announcing their own chain. But as far as I know, when DYDX announced we're building their own chain, they already had like a huge user base. They had, strong presence in the market. A lot of folks knew about DYDX. For someone who's looking to build a new application, what advice would you give them? Should they be launching on any of the existing chains to tap into the composability and existing liquidity, or should you be trying to build your own rollup from day one?
Yeah, I mean, by the way, historically, I think it was Compound that started the whole thing. I don't think it materialized, but Compound was probably the first DeFi project that showed intentions of building their own chain, but it didn't work out, I think. And DYDX was the one they actually went out by being on Ethereum. But it's also a special case, right? Because you could see Cosmos projects coming up, building DeFi directly on Cosmos. But DYDX was a good example of people, someone starting on Ethereum, kind of migrating to Starkware and then moving away from there and building their own chain. So I would say, still, people, of course, fight and say, I have 100 users, you have 20 users and things like that. But in the end, it's all about distribution, right? If you don't have users, maybe for a while you will get love and attention because something works out for you. But in the end, you have to get users. So what we've seen is people building DeFi, we still encourage them to go and build on chain where they can find liquidity, because otherwise it's still quite hard. I mean, none of the liquidity solutions are out there. Even, I don't know, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, Justin was talking about based liquidity or mechanisms where you can tap into that. But none of that is there, right? And people are building all sorts of omni liquidity layer, but nothing is really quite there. So I would say if you are building a DeFi project where you need huge composability, you can't live without it, just stay there. Stay on a certain chain that has liquidity, which could be Arbitrum. It doesn't necessarily have to be Ethereum. It could be any chain that has liquidity. But people who are thinking about socials, people who are thinking about games, where you do not necessarily need, financial liquidity. What you need is more of a user liquidity. Like you want users, you have to find your own distribution channels. It's not. I mean, you have to give credit to Solana, despite. I mean, back in 2017, I guess Tezos and EOS were the only ones that were designing languages that was not Solidity, right? They're building chains without that. And they got a lot of pushback. People would say they were not successful. But now you're seeing a new wave of things, where people are bringing new kind of languages, and kudos to Movement Labs as well on building this. So I would say, go and find your distribution channel. If you have existing because some of the gaming companies, they come from Web2 style gaming and they already have a distribution channel. You should naturally go and build your own chain. You shouldn't go and build on Ethereum, Arbitrum, or whatsoever. Go and build your own chain.
Yeah, I think for a lot of projects that are right now thinking about what place they will call home initially, right? It's a very tough choice because you have so many options now, and there's really a lot of reasons to stay on like an ecosystem that already works. Because you have liquidity there, you have users there, you need to capture them, which is a hard enough job. And you don't want to like fragment that further with your own chain. However, for some cases, you actually want to have your own block space. And what I mean by that is there's still like a large dependency if you are on a public blockchain that is shared through like multiple projects, that you're obviously impacted by that usage. And in a lot of cases, like when there's a big game launching on Arbitrum, right, it could be that your financial application is impacted by that. And I think that sort of opportunity cost obviously only comes with users. But if you think about it, if you have ambitions because you're building, like, for example, a perp DEX that should work all the time and you want to get as much revenue as possible, right, through your trading fees, then the cost that you have for operating a rollup might be smaller than actually the opportunity cost that you have if there's some potential downtime every year on a public blockchain, especially as you go into a bull market. Obviously, that can change over time, but I think in a lot of cases, if you have a very strong go-to-market, your own chain can be a significant benefit from that perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. I think one thing that's maybe not talked about enough is, you guys alluded to earlier, is how expensive it is to run your own chain as well. So if you're on a public blockchain, you don't have to think about Explorer, you don't have to think about RPC nodes or anything, but if you're building your own thing, you have to worry about each and every stack, and that will bring costs and maybe potential latency as well. Yeah, thank you so much for, giving that views. One thing that was also previously discussed was, even if a user has 50 tokens, they don't want to be transacting on 100 other chains, right? And one potential solution that we have seen, which is catching a lot of attention right now, is the concept of chain abstraction. You want to abstract away all the complexities from the user, show them a unified view. They don't really care what underlying chains are being used. Would love to understand, how do you see this chain abstraction, coming up and helping the modular narrative? And how do we tackle, will users be comfortable with not knowing everything? Are they comfortable with different security solutions that are underlying this chain abstraction?
I think users at the end of the day will be fine with that, is what my opinion is. Okay. I think that's more of a concern for us as people building and developing, yes. But the end user at the end of the day wants to be able to transact, do whatever they can, the easiest way possible. Like if you come from the Web 2 kind of space, like no one knows, like, is AWS running this? Is it GCP? Is whatever it is? No one cares. They just care about whatever their end goal is for using that application.
But wouldn't you say in the Web 2 world, we are actually in a very trusted model, and we are kind of trusting the security of those Web 2 companies. But with Web 3, the overall thesis was that we want to be trustless. We don't want to place our trust in someone, especially if we are doing a high dollar value transaction. So, the counter thesis could be that users do want to care about who they are transacting with. But I'm getting that your view is that user won't care, and it's more the responsibility of the service providers to worry about the security models of the underlying infrastructure.
I think giving users the chance to like opt in if they want to is good, but like I still feel like the majority of users will probably not opt in. But giving them the ability to opt in then like gives you like the ability to give people that proper UX while still allowing, I guess, like more power users or people who do care about that to like dive in and understand the parts of the stack. So.
Got it. This is one question where I would love to get Patrick and Amrit, your views as well.
Yeah, I think chain abstraction, like overall from a UX perspective, it's great because especially for new users, it's such a headache sometimes to get funds on a chain and transact on the chain. Then, especially if you're new, the thing can be on Ethereum, it can be on Base, and why do you pay like 10 or 100x the fees, right? It's very hard to grasp initially. And users, to be fair, shouldn't also be concerned with that. So I think the whole the narrative and the idea about it is amazing. However, I would definitely agree. There will be users that will stay on one chain for the culture. I mean, if the comeback from Solana is like one thing, then that there is a certain cultural aspect to a chain, and people call that specific chain their home. And that doesn't mean that they don't transact on other chains, but there is a reason why there are certain memes are just on Solana, and I think that cultural aspect can apply to specific chains, but for new users, I think it will be amazing if like chain abstraction is actually there and they don't need to care about all these complexities that we have today.
I mean, I can rant about this all day. I mean, I feel like we as builders have completely ignored users for since the very beginning, right? You know, we know that, you know, even today, half of the people use the same passwords everywhere, and people are struggling with passwords. Now we are saying, you know what? Now you have to deal with this private key, which is like a nightmare. Like imagine back in, I don't know, when you were in the early days of your high school, you would say, you know, you have to do SSH every single time when you log in. No, you can't use passwords anymore. And that's kind of where crypto has brought in. You know, we expect users to be I don't know, have super high IQ, be able to understand how these private key, public key work, and then force them to have 15 chains in the Avail interface, for example, right? It's just impossible. So I would say that, you know, we have to change our mindset. It cannot just be, okay, now that we have this, let's bring something else, and now we're going to fix what we had previously. I think there has to be a fundamental change in the way we think, because we have ended up building things. Yes, it's fine that you, like what I'm saying is that developers have ended up building things for themselves, essentially. Right. I think, yes, it's okay. Initially, that's how it works, because, you know, you do it as a fun project and you build things. But there's a huge gap between, like if you look at, you know, OpenAI, right, or ChatGPT, it came much later, even though it started probably at the same time as, you know, Ethereum or Bitcoin. It came much later, and you can feel it. You don't have to understand how the underlying LLM model works. You just use it, right? And so I think we have to change our mentality, and, you know, okay, now we are going to bring this chain abstraction thing and then bring up with no more fancy names, and I think it has to go away entirely. This whole blockchain has to go to the background. And people have to be, you know, we should give people products that actually can use without any of that MetaMask mumbo jumbo that, you know, we are throwing them in the face at the moment. So I would say, yes, chain abstraction is good, you know, account abstraction is good, but still, it's nowhere close to what a user should be given, right? In a traditional product way. So I'm hopeful, but I feel like we have to change our mentality. It just cannot be. If you're looking for users, you can't just be building for developers. You have to build for users in the end.
Yeah, just to add on top of that, I agree. However, like one thing I think, which is the beauty of like Ethereum as a whole, is that you don't wait to ship as soon as everything's perfect. I'm sure like OpenAI had a lot of iterations on their UX to really make it that easy. But I think one of basically the beauty of like this whole developer ecosystem is that we're like figuring it out together, right? That's where we talk about it. That's where we try to really learn from each other, like what works, what doesn't. And we find like the right solution over time. Maybe it takes longer, but bottom line is we don't lose like the decentralized ethos that every party can commit, can make a PR, it gets added, right? And you find the best solution as like a community.
Yeah, no, in fact, I would argue that wouldn't slow it down. It would expedite. Look at what, Elon did with the space industry. Like NASA used to write everything, and they had such lengthy projects, and they just kept on iterating by crashing the rockets. But yeah, we are almost in time, and I'm really glad the conversation, ended with a very heavy focus on what do we want, for our users. The idea is that regardless of what mumbo jumbo is going on in the background, we have to serve the users. And with that key takeaway, I would like to thank all the panelists for sharing, their insights. It's been super amazing to get your thoughts on how developers are thinking about it and how do you think this space will evolve. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone.